In the cold breath of late autumn, as the leaves turned amber and clung desperately to the branches of the forest, the village of Bramblewick prepared for the annual tithe. It was the season when the bounty of the fields, however meager, must be surrendered to the Lord's manor. The people of the village, thin and bowed with the year's labor, gathered what remained of their crops, sacks of barley, ropes of onions, dried peas, and bruised apples, to present at the gates of Thornhollow Hall. Atop the hill, the manor loomed like a stone giant, gray and expressionless, with smoke curling from its twin chimneys and banners fluttering in the damp wind. Lord Edric, master of this realm, prepared for a feast to honor the harvest. Within his hall, life bore no resemblance to the hardship of Bramblewick. While peasants rationed turnips, here the air was heavy with roasted meats, spiced wine, and the laughter of nobility. The feast table, a marvel of oaken carving, sagged beneath the weight of dishes unknown to most villagers. Platters of venison, whole roasted pheasants with golden crisp skin, bowls of sugared almonds, honeyed pies filled with quince and gooseberries. These were delicacies beyond imagining. Edric's steward, Master Hallwyn, supervised the placement of every goblet and trencher, ensuring that no lord or lady would want for pleasure. Among the guests was Lady Marin of Ashcombe, draped in velvet the color of midnight. Her fingers glittered with rings set with garnet and pearl, and she sipped from a cup carved of silver as though it were no more than a child's toy. Beside her sat Sir Elric, who had once ridden with the king's host and now boasted of battles as he carved into a glazed boar's head, laughing through mouthfuls of meat. The hall echoed with the music of minstrels, their lutes plucking soft harmonies beneath the rise and fall of noble voices. Yet outside, on the edge of the manor grounds, Ulrich and his neighbors stood in the drizzle, clutching their offerings like relics from a different world. The smell of roast and wine drifted from the manor, mingling cruelly with the ache in their bellies. For those below, the feast was not cause for celebration. It marked the end of their harvest, what little had survived pests and poor soil, and now it was no longer theirs. Children watched with hollow eyes as carts rolled past, carrying what should have fed their families into the arms of the manor kitchens. No coin was given in return. This was their duty, their debt, their birthright as peasants beneath a feudal crown. Elswith held Edith close, whispering reassurances that tasted like ash. They would make do, she said. They always had. But her voice faltered when she saw the steward's dogs fed with bones richer than any supper they had known in weeks. Inside, Lord Edric raised his goblet and spoke of abundance. Let it be known, he intoned, that Thornhollow flourishes by the grace of God and the strength of our people. Cheers answered him, though none came from the courtyard. Later that evening, once the nobles had laughed themselves into stupor and the fire had dwindled to embers, the manor's waste was thrown into the midden, bones with meat still clinging, rinds of cheese, crusts of bread untouched. A silent war began, fought not with swords but with hands. Children creeping to the edge of the pit to scavenge, hearts pounding, afraid of the guards who sometimes beat the desperate away. Wymond, too young to fear shame, returned to the cottage with a strip of half-eaten carrot he had stolen from a discarded platter. Elswith wept as she washed it clean, blessing the boy with trembling fingers. Even the scraps of the mighty, she murmured, are more than we deserve. But it was not only food that marked the chasm between highborn and low. In the manor, the rooms were warmed by braziers of coal and hung with tapestries depicting hunts and legends. The stone floors were strewn with rushes perfumed with lavender, changed each fortnight. In Bramblewick's cottages, floors were earth, and the only fragrance came from damp straw and the scent of livestock that shared the dwelling. Lords wore hose and brocade stitched with gold thread. Ulrich wore the same tunic he had worn for 4 winters, patched at the elbows and thinning at the knees. Even the boots of a page boy in the manor were of better leather than his. More than once, Ulrich wondered what it would be like to stand in the hall as a guest, to sit on a cushioned bench, to taste a pie still warm from the oven, to drink wine not watered down with vinegar. But such dreams were dangerous. Hope was a luxury, and those who spoke of equality too loudly often vanished into the woods, never to return. And so the people of Bramblewick bowed their heads as the nobles toasted the land. knowing it was the peasants who had tilled it, who had suffered for it, and who would go hungry still. The Feast of Thorn Hollow became legend in the manor, remembered fondly by the lords who had gorged themselves upon its splendor. But in the village below, it became a tale told in hushed tones around dying fires. Not a story of glory, but of contrast, of how one hill could hold both feast and famine, divided not by distance, but by birth. And as snow threatened the horizon and the stores in the cottage grew thin, Ulrich lay beside his wife in the cold silence of night. "Perhaps," he whispered, "the spring will be kinder." But neither of them truly believed it. In the cold breath of late autumn, as the leaves turned amber and clung desperately to the branches of the forest, the village of Bramblewick prepared for the annual tithe. It was the season when the bounty of the fields, however meager, must be surrendered to the Lord's manor. The people of the village, thin and bowed with the year's labor, gathered what remained of their crops: sacks of barley, ropes of onions, dried peas, and bruised apples, to present at the gates of Thornhollow Hall. Atop the hill, the manor loomed like a stone giant, gray and expressionless, with smoke curling from its twin chimneys and banners fluttering in the damp wind. Lord Edric, master of this realm, prepared for a feast to honor the harvest. Within his hall, life bore no resemblance to the hardship of Bramblewick. While peasants rationed turnips, here the air was heavy with roasted meats, spiced wine, and the laughter of nobility. The feast table, a marvel of oak and carving, sagged beneath the weight of dishes unknown to most villagers. Platters of venison, whole roasted pheasants with golden crisp skin, bowls of sugared almonds, honeyed pies filled with quince and gooseberries. These were delicacies beyond imagining. Edric's steward, Master Hallwyn, supervised the placement of every goblet and trencher, ensuring that no lord or lady would want for pleasure. Among the guests was Lady Marin of Ashcombe, draped in velvet the color of midnight. Her fingers glittered with rings set with garnet and pearl, and she sipped from a cup carved of silver as though it were no more than a child's toy. Beside her sat Sir Elric, who had once ridden with the king's host and now boasted of battles as he carved into a glazed boar's head, laughing through mouthfuls of meat. The hall echoed with the music of minstrels, their lutes plucking soft harmonies beneath the rise and fall of noble voices. Yet outside, on the edge of the manor grounds, Ulrich and his neighbors stood in the drizzle, clutching their offerings like relics from a different world. The smell of roast and wine drifted from the manor, mingling cruelly with the ache in their bellies. For those below, the feast was not cause for celebration. It marked the end of their harvest, what little had survived pests and poor soil, and now it was no longer theirs. Children watched with hollow eyes as carts rolled past, carrying what should have fed their families into the arms of the manor kitchens. No coin was given in return. This was their duty, their debt, their birthright as peasants beneath a feudal crown. Elswith held Edith close, whispering reassurances that tasted like ash. They would make do, she said. They always had. But her voice faltered when she saw the steward's dogs fed with bones richer than any supper they had known in weeks. Inside, Lord Edric raised his goblet and spoke of abundance. "Let it be known," he intoned, "that Thornhollow flourishes by the grace of God and the strength of our people." Cheers answered him, though none came from the courtyard. Later that evening, once the nobles had laughed themselves into stupor and the fire had dwindled to embers, the manor's waste was thrown into the midden, bones with meat still clinging, rinds of cheese, crusts of bread untouched. A silent war began, fought not with swords but with hands, children creeping to the edge of the pit to scavenge, hearts pounding, afraid of the guards who sometimes beat the desperate away. Wiemund, too young to fear shame, returned to the cottage with a strip of half-eaten carrot he had stolen from a discarded platter. Elswith wept as she washed it clean, blessing the boy with trembling fingers. "Even the scraps of the mighty," she murmured, "are more than we deserve." But it was not only food that marked the chasm between highborn and low. In the manor, the rooms were warmed by braziers of coal and hung with tapestries depicting hunts and legends. The stone floors were strewn with rushes perfumed with lavender, changed each fortnight. In Bramblewick's cottages, floors were earth, and the only fragrance came from damp straw and the scent of livestock that shared the dwelling. Lords wore hose and brocade stitched with gold thread. Ulrich wore the same tunic he had worn for 4 winters, patched at the elbows and thinning at the knees. Even the boots of a page boy in the manor were of better leather than his. More than once, Ulrich wondered what it would be like to stand in the hall as a guest, to sit on a cushioned bench, to taste a pie still warm from the oven, to drink wine not watered down with vinegar. But such dreams were dangerous. Hope was a luxury, and those who spoke of equality too loudly often vanished into the woods, never to return. And so the people of Bramblewick bowed their heads as the nobles toasted the land, knowing it was the peasants who had tilled it, who had suffered for it, and who would go hungry still. The Feast of Thornhollow became legend in the manor, remembered fondly by the lords who had gorged themselves upon its splendor. But in the village below, it became a tale told in hushed tones around dying fires. Not a story of glory, but of contrast, of how one hill could hold both feast and famine, divided not by distance, but by birth. And as snow threatened the horizon and the stores in the cottage grew thin, Ulrich lay beside his wife in the cold silence of night. Perhaps, he whispered, the spring will be kinder. But neither of them truly believed it. In the dim heart of winter, when the winds curled like ghosts through the hollows of the trees, and the days shrank into brief, brittle spans of gray light, sickness came to Bramblewick. It came quietly at first, whispered in the wheezing cough of old widow Marga, whose breath rattled in her throat like a broken bell. She had lived through 7 decades, some said, surviving famine and flood, and even the cruel winter of the wolf packs. But now, she lay motionless beneath woolen blankets, her thin fingers clutching a wooden rosary, her eyes sunken with fever. By week's end, the cough had spread like spilled ink, seeping into every corner of the village. The cooper's wife, strong and red-cheeked just days before, began to cough blood into her apron. Her child, barely past infancy, followed soon after. It was as though the very air had turned sour, poisoned by unseen spirits or perhaps divine punishment for sins unnamed. In such times, fear moved faster than reason. There were no physicians in Bramblewick. None had ever set foot within its muddy lanes. Physicians belonged to towns and courts, to places where coin flowed and Latin was spoken over ledgers and bodies alike. Here, there were no tomes of Galen, no silver instruments, no leeches arranged in neat little jars. Here, there was only old Geetha, the village herb woman, whose knowledge was as old as the forest and just as wild. Geetha walked from cottage to cottage with her basket of dried herbs, Angelica, horehound, and elder bark, her lips moving constantly in whispered charms. She was both healer and relic, feared and respected in equal measure. She brewed thick teas of mugwort and betony, pressed poultices to chests, and bound rosemary above every lintel. She spoke of bad humors and corrupted winds, of the moon's pull on the body and the need to balance bile and blood. But none of it stopped the coughing. Ulrich's son, little Wymond, was the first to fall ill in their home. One morning, he refused to rise. His limbs trembled, and his cheeks were flushed with a fever that did not break, no matter how Ellsworth bathed his brow with river-cold cloths. His breathing came in shallow rasps, like a bird caught in a thorn bush. He cried once, then fell silent, his voice stolen by the illness. Ellsworth did not sleep. She sat at his side for 3 days and 3 nights, rocking him gently, singing old lullabies under her breath. Her hands, calloused and cracked, moved with tenderness as she spooned bitter broth into his mouth, hoping that even a single swallow might grant strength. But Wymond would only turn his face away. Ulrich watched helplessly. A man of the earth, he had always believed in sweat and labor, in the surety of furrows and grain. But this invisible thief that stole his son's breath, was beyond his reach. He had no sword to fight it, no field to plow it under. "We must send for someone," he whispered on the second night. "There is no one to send for," Ellsworth replied, her voice hoarse. But in desperation, Ulrich walked to the manor gates. He stood beneath the carved stone arch, calling up to the guards. "Please," he shouted, "my son is dying. Does the Lord not keep a physician?" The gate did not open. A voice answered from the tower. "The manor is sealed. None from the village may enter. Orders from Lord Edric." He stood there a long time, until the snow began to fall. Within Thornhollow Hall, the sickness was spoken of only in hushed tones. The nobility feared contagion as much as they feared rebellion. Fires were lit at every doorway. Sweet herbs burned in braziers. Servants were forbidden from approaching the village. And in the great hall, the steward assured Lord Edric that the illness would not cross the river. "We are protected," the steward said. "God favors those who are clean." Ulrich returned home with nothing but silence in his hands. He found Wyman breathing more slowly now, his chest rising and falling, as if each breath had to be summoned from some distant shore. That night, Elswith knelt beside her son and prayed until her knees bled. She prayed to Saint Apollonia, to Saint Blaise, to every saint whose name she remembered. But no angels came. When morning came, Wyman's eyes had stilled. His lips were pale. The warmth had left his body, slipping through the cracks in the thatched roof and into the cold sky. Elswith made no sound. She wrapped her son in linen, kissed his brow, and placed a sprig of dried lavender in his hands. Ulrich dug the grave himself, beside the stream where Wyman had once floated leaves like boats. There was no priest, only the soft sobs of Edith and the hollow weight of loss. And still, the physician never came. In the days that followed, the sickness slowly loosened its grip. Those who survived bore it in their chests for weeks, coughing as though each breath might be their last. Some recovered, others did not. But life in Bramblewick crept forward, as it always did, pulled onward by necessity more than hope. The cradle in the corner remained untouched. Elswith kept it clean, but would not look at it for long. Edith, who had once laughed freely, now walked with quieter steps, glancing often at her mother as if unsure whether to speak. At the church, Father Osmond delivered sermons to a thinned congregation. He spoke of trial and divine testing, of suffering that purified the soul. But no words could mend what had been broken. That winter, no one sang during the feast of St. Nicholas. There were no garlands of holly, no games in the snow. The village held its breath, fearing that joy might invite grief anew. And far above them, Thornhollow Hall gleamed in candlelight, its halls warm and untouched. The physician never came, and though no record of the sickness would ever appear in the steward's ledger, the people of Bramblewick would remember it always, as the winter when they were left to die alone. At the edge of Bramblewick, where the winding track curved into the forest's waiting arms, there stood an old gallows tree. It was not a tree in the natural sense, but rather a structure of rough-hewn beams nailed into the twisted limbs of an ancient oak, its bark blackened by time and crows. The villagers called it the Hanging Oak, though most did not speak its name aloud. It stood as a silent monument to justice, justice not of mercy nor of reason, but of power. And beneath its gnarled branches, men had danced their final dance. Justice in Thornhollow was not dispensed in marble halls or through trained advocates. There were no juries, no appeals. The lord of the manor was the law. And Lord Edric, though not known for madness, was no gentle arbiter. His word was final, his gaze sharp, and his punishments as swift as they were severe. In the winter following the sickness, a theft occurred in Bramblewick. A bag of oats, no more than a week's meal, had vanished from the manor's storehouse. The steward discovered it missing during one of his early checks, and the alarm spread quickly. It was not merely the loss of food that stoked fury, it was the challenge to authority, the insult to order. Lord Edric summoned a trial, not in the modern sense, but a gathering of villagers beneath the shadow of the Hanging Oak. It was a scene of grim ritual. The entire village was ordered to attend, lest they be thought complicit. The steward read the charge in a clipped voice, and Lord Edric sat upon a wooden chair draped with his family's crest, observing each villager with the gaze of a hawk watching the field for movement. No one confessed. Of course not. To admit guilt was to die, and so suspicion was cast not by evidence, but by glances, by gossip, by the trembling hesitation of a man too poor to defend himself. That man, as it happened, was Brand, a young swineherd, whose father had died the previous year and whose mother was now too ill to work. He had little, and what little he had was envy from others. Someone whispered that Brand had visited the manor's grain house once during a storm. Another claimed they had seen him walking near the fields by night. That was enough. The steward declared the case decided. Brand would hang at sunrise. The crowd murmured, but none dared protest. To question the decision was to draw the eye of Lord Edric, and no one wished to be next beneath the oak. Brand's mother fell to her knees, begging for her son's life, her voice hoarse with desperation. "He is but a boy," she cried. He has done no harm." Edric did not respond. His silence spoke louder than any word. At dawn, the village assembled once more. Snow had fallen in the night, laying a pale shroud over the world. The hanging oak stood darker than ever against the white. Brand, bound and pale, was led beneath its boughs by two of the Lord's men-at-arms. He did not struggle, nor did he speak. Whether he had stolen the oat, a rope was tied, a prayer was read, the birds scattered, and Brand was gone. Ulrich held Edith's hand tightly as the deed was done. She had begged not to go, but it was required. All must witness the price of disobedience. Elswith stood behind them, her face unreadable, her shawl pulled low over her brow. That night, the village was quieter than it had been since the plague. No one sang, no one spoke above a whisper. The gallows remained, empty but ever watching. The crows returned by morning, perching where the boy had last drawn breath. What lingered was not justice, but fear. The kind that crept into the bones, that made men hesitate before speaking, that silenced old women's warnings. Justice in Thorn Hollow was a blade that swung in the dark, not knowing if it would strike the guilty or the poor. Elswith, who had watched her own son buried months before, wept not just for Brand, but for the world that allowed such cruelty. "This is not order," she whispered into the night. "This is survival dressed as law." Ulrich, for all his strength, could not disagree. Yet what choice had any of them? To speak was to suffer. To protest was to vanish. In the manorial world, obedience was the coin of the realm, and silence was often the only armor the poor possessed. But the story of Brand was not forgotten. It was retold in quiet places, in cautious voices, in lullabies that warned children to walk carefully and speak softly. He became more than a swineherd. He became a lesson, and the hanging oak remained. Years later, when travelers passed through Bramblewick, they sometimes asked about the dark structure on the hill. The villagers would smile thinly and change the subject. Only the oldest would speak, in hushed tones, of the winter when justice took the wrong boy. And far above, in Thornhollow Hall, Lord Edric continued to dine by candlelight, unaware, or perhaps unmoved, by the shadows he cast upon the village below. Before dawn touched the horizon with even the faintest hue of gray, small hands were already at work. In Bramblewick, childhood was not a time of wonder or play, but a brief interlude before the burdens of labor took hold. By the age of 5 or 6, a child was expected to contribute, however little, to the work that sustained the household. And by 10, most were indistinguishable from adults in toil, though still miniature in form, with eyes too old for their years. Edith, now nearing her 12th winter, had long since left behind the dreams of toys or stories by firelight. Her days began with the kindling of the hearth, her fingers numb as she coaxed embers from the ash. By the time the sky paled, she was already outside, a woven basket on her back, sent to gather kindling, mushrooms, or nettles, whatever the forest might offer without taking offense. Her palms were rough, her nails cracked from scrubbing laundry in freezing water. Her spine ached from bending to weed the narrow garden plot behind the cottage. And still, she did not complain. To complain was to waste breath. To dream of rest was to invite hunger. All across Bramblewick, children shared her fate. The miller's son tended the grindstone with trembling arms. The blacksmith's twin daughters stoked the forge bellows. Even the youngest, barely able to carry a pail, were made to chase hens or scatter seed. There were no schools for children like Edith. Books were treasures of the church or the manor, and letters were tools of priests and stewards. She could not read the scriptures carved into the chapel's stone walls, but she knew the names of every herb that grew between the hedgerows. She could not write a poem, but she could count eggs, patch a tunic, and bind a wound. One morning, while foraging by the tree line, Edith stumbled upon another girl, no older than herself, kneeling in the frost. The girl's name was Tilla, daughter of the village weaver, and she was gathering thistles with bare hands, her breath short and labored. When Edith asked why she had no gloves, Tilla smiled weakly. "My brother took them," she said. "He has blisters. I don't mind." Edith said nothing, but after returning home, she snuck one of her own mittens into her pocket and gave it to Tilla the next morning. They never spoke of it again. Though their work was hard and unending, the children of Bramblewick rarely received praise. Their labor was expected, invisible in the eyes of those around them. When the harvest was poor, they were blamed. When it was bountiful, the credit went to heaven or to the Lord. Rarely to the children whose hands had pulled weeds, hauled stones, or scattered crows from the fields. Some nights, Ulrich would sit by the hearth and watch Edith stitch a tear in his sleeve, the needle moving steadily through cloth despite the fading light. He saw the tremble in her wrists, the tightness in her shoulders, and wondered what she might have become had she been born into another world. But he never said it aloud. Dreams were dangerous things. In the manor above, Lord Edric's sons were taught by a tutor brought from the distant city of Ely. They learned Latin and Greek, the histories of ancient Rome, the principles of geometry and rhetoric. They trained with wooden swords in the courtyard, practicing for wars they might never fight, wearing furs and cloaks lined with silk. Edith once saw them ride past the village, their horses sleek and their faces full of laughter. She stood in the wheat field, clutching a bundle of stalks, and watched them disappear into the forest trail. For a moment, she allowed herself to wonder, what was it like to sit and learn, to be warmed by knowledge instead of toil? But such thoughts, like birds, passed quickly. In the depth of winter, the tasks grew harder. The soil froze, and the days grew shorter. Yet the demands of survival did not yield. Edith and the other children carried wood, fetched water, scraped frost from window frames, and tended the animals with aching hands. Their backs grew stronger, but their innocence grew thinner with each passing year. There were no toys save those carved from scrap wood, no games save those invented during brief moments between chores. Laughter came in bursts quick, brittle, and easily lost. And yet, among themselves, the children found small moments of companionship. They shared secrets beneath hedges, carved symbols into tree trunks, and sang softly when the adults were out of earshot. Their songs were not joyful, but they were theirs. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of soot, Edith sat beside Tilla on the stone wall that marked the edge of the barley field. They were both exhausted, their cloaks dusted with earth, their hair tangled with straw. "Do you think it will always be like this?" Tilla asked, her voice barely above a breath. Edith looked toward the distant hills. "Maybe," she said, "but maybe not." It was not hope, not really. It was something quieter, resilience, perhaps, the kind that grows not from joy, but from necessity. A seed buried beneath hardship, waiting for a spring that might never come. The world of Bramblewick demanded much from its children. It gave little in return. Yet even in that cold soil, something human endured. And so they labored. Not because they were strong, but because there was no other way. Because the fire had to be fed, the goats had to be milked, the floor had to be swept. Because their small hands, though weary, kept the village alive. And above them, in the warmth of Thornhollow Hall, no one remembered the names of the girls in the fields. The year the bread failed was remembered not by date, but by absence. It began with a spring that never softened. The earth, so often pliant beneath the thaw, remained hard and reluctant. The plow bit shallow into soil cracked like old leather, and seeds planted with trembling hands found no purchase. The rains did not come. The sun, so longed for during the gray months, now baked the fields into dust. By midsummer, the barley was stunted, the oats brittle, peas shriveled before they ripened, and the flax curled into pale husks. In the gardens behind each cottage, the cabbages failed to bulb, and even the weeds began to die. At first, the villagers whispered of poor luck, of a strange season, of bad air. But as weeks passed and nothing improved, their voices grew quieter. When the mill wheel slowed, not for repair but for lack of grain, the truth could no longer be denied. The harvest was failing. By August, panic had begun to take root. Ulrich stared at his meager plot with hollow eyes. What once would have filled a cart could now barely fill a basket. The fields that had yielded just enough in years past now mocked him with their silence. He ran his fingers through the dry stalks, lifting dust instead of hope. Elswith rationed carefully. She cut thinner slices of bread, added more water to the stew, stretched the barley with ground acorns. She fed the children first. She always had. But her own face grew sharper, her cheeks more hollow with each passing week. Edith, now old enough to understand the danger, no longer asked for seconds. She learned to ignore the rumble in her belly, to chew slowly and pretend it was enough. She helped her mother grind roots and glean the forest's edges for mushrooms and bitter greens. The village bell, once rung only for prayer or danger, began to toll weekly, to summon villagers for announcements of rationing, to mourn the first deaths not by fever, but by famine. It was the elders who went first. Widow Marga, too frail to rise from bed, Father Osmond, whose sermons had grown quieter each Sunday until he no longer had the strength to climb the chapel steps. Then it was the infants, unable to withstand the long hunger. Mothers wept silently as their babies faded like candle flames in the wind. There were no burials with pomp or prayer, only shallow graves dug with numb hands in the frozen soil behind the chapel. Even the gravedigger, Oswin, collapsed one morning beside his spade, never to rise again. By late autumn, desperation had begun to take root. Some villagers turned to the forest hunting with snares and traps, but even the animals had grown scarce. Squirrels were fought over. Crows were caught and cooked whole, feathers and all. Rats became a delicacy. Geetha, the old healer, began boiling leather scraps into broth and instructing families how to prepare tree bark in a way that wouldn't poison them. Stealing, once unthinkable among neighbors, began to spread like fire. A turnip vanished from a garden. A hen disappeared. And when the miller's last sack of grain was found emptied, the village nearly tore itself apart. Still, the manor remained untouched. Lord Edric, ever distant, kept his stores guarded. From time to time, his steward would throw down scraps to the villagers: spoiled meat, mold-rimmed bread, the crumbs of banquets eaten behind stone walls. The act was framed as charity, but no one was fooled. It was not mercy. It was control. Ulrich, gaunt and hollow-eyed, stood one evening with the others beneath the manor gate as a basket of crusts was lowered. He caught a piece, barely edible, and gave it to Edith without hesitation. She took it without a word, but he saw her hesitate before biting. He could see in her eyes what he felt in his bones: shame, not for being hungry, but for being treated like dogs. Elswith fell ill in early winter, not with plague or fever, but with something quieter: exhaustion. Her body, long depleted, could give no more. She could not keep warm. Her hands, once steady, shook with every movement. Ulrich kept her close to the fire, wrapped her in their last good blanket, and watched her breathe, each inhale a question. Edith took her place in the garden, digging the snow for roots. She watched her father with the weight of someone who had forgotten how to be a child. Wyman's cradle was still in the corner, now used to hold firewood. The famine taught them that hunger was not a moment, but a season, that it dulled the mind, twisted the soul, made strangers of neighbors and shadows of those you loved. It taught them that hope could die slowly, like embers cooling beneath ash, and still no help came. One night, as wind howled through the thatch and the stars flickered above like dying sparks, Ulrich sat beside Elswith and held her hand. "We were not meant to live this way," he whispered. She said nothing. Outside, the village lay silent, save for the creak of the hanging oak swaying in the cold. The year without bread passed, as all years do. Some survived, many did not, but none who lived through it would ever forget. Hunger, once a stranger, had become a familiar, an unwelcome guest who knew their names, their weaknesses, their fears. And though the fields would one day yield again, the memory of that long season would remain, stitched into every harvest, buried beneath every loaf, and whispered in every empty stomach that dared to grumble. Every village in Christendom had its church. In Bramblewick, it was a squat stone building with moss-covered walls and a crooked bell tower, built before any living soul could remember. Though small and cold, it was the center of the village, not in joy, but in reverence and fear. The church in medieval life was not merely a place of worship. It was a constant presence, like the wind or the Lord's tax. It touched every moment, from birth to death, from harvest to hunger, and though it promised heaven, it often delivered guilt. Each morning, as mist drifted across the barley fields, the bell tolled a single, solemn chime. It was Father Osmond who rang it, tall and thin, with a face like old parchment and eyes that rarely blinked. He had lived in Bramblewick longer than most could remember, arriving as a young priest and aging like weathered stone. He preached every Sunday, wrapped in heavy woolen robes stitched with faded thread. His sermons echoed through the pewless nave, bouncing off the damp walls and the bowed heads of the villagers. His voice was slow, deliberate, and without warmth. The gospel in his hands became law. Sin, in his eyes, was everywhere. Elswith attended every mass, though she never looked Father Osmond in the eye. She kept her hands folded, her veil drawn low, her lips silently reciting Latin she did not understand. Edith knelt beside her, mimicking the motions without knowing their meaning. Ulrich stood behind them, tall and still, a farmer turned penitent. They did not go out of devotion. They went because not going was unthinkable. The church taught that suffering was holy, that their hunger was a test, that their losses were the will of God, that the plague was sent to cleanse the soul, that poverty was the path to heaven. Those with full stomachs might doubt such claims, but for the poor, there was little else to believe. Tithes were expected, even in famine. 1/10 of what little they grew or raised was delivered to the chapel. Dried beans, eggs, wool, or chickens, if any were left. Even a dying cow was still considered worthy for the Lord's table. The church, like the manor, took before it gave. When Wyman died, Father Osmond offered a burial, but only after Ulrich handed over the last of their honey and a pair of unspoiled boots. The priest said the child's soul would rest easier with proper rites. Elswith had not spoken for hours after. Inside the chapel, the air always smelled of beeswax and mildew. A cracked statue of the Virgin watched over the altar, her face stained with the soot of countless candles. The saints stood in niches, St. Cuthbert, St. Agnes, St. Blaise, all carved in rough wood, their expressions lost to time and smoke. The villagers prayed to them for mercy, for healing, for rain, but the saints did not answer. One autumn, when a child went missing in the woods, the villagers gathered in the chapel by torchlight. They lit candles, they sang hymns, they begged the saints to return the girl. Days passed. Then a hunter found her, lifeless beneath a fallen tree. It was God's will, said Father Osmond. He takes the pure first. But Ulrich, standing among the mourners, clenched his fists. His faith, never strong, began to tremble. For centuries, the church had promised salvation in exchange for obedience. It offered a map to the hereafter, but no help for the now. It told the poor to be meek, to accept suffering as virtue, to give without question. And still, the world grew colder, harder. There were moments, private, brief, when Elswith would sit alone and whisper to the Virgin statue, not in prayer, but in desperation. Why, she would ask. Why take the good? Why bless the cruel? Why silence? But the stone mother gave no reply. Edith, more curious than devout, once asked her father why God needed coin. Ulrich had no answer. He told her only to keep her questions quiet. The church's shadow was long. Rumors spoke of other villages where heretics had been burned, where midwives were branded witches, where a missing tithe could bring a curse upon one's harvest. Geetha, the healer, walked carefully near the chapel, her knowledge tolerated only because she kept her head bowed and never contradicted the priest aloud. Yet despite everything, the villagers still came to Mass. They still knelt, still confessed, still crossed themselves before entering the forest. For even in doubt, they feared the absence of protection more than the weight of ritual. When the famine struck and the dead outnumbered the living, Father Osmond gave longer sermons. He warned of the end times. He spoke of judgment, but he never shared the chapel's stores, nor opened its cellar. Behind the altar, it was said, there were barrels of wheat and dried fish sent from the bishop's manor. One night, a boy broke into the chapel seeking food. He was caught. The next morning, Father Osmond declared it a desecration. The chapel bell tolled 7 times in mourning. The boy was sent to labor in the manor stables. He never returned. From that day forward, the children of Bramblewick looked at the chapel with wide, quiet eyes. In time, Father Osmond grew frail. His sermons became whispers. His hands shook as he lifted the chalice. When he died, few wept. The new priest, sent from the bishopric, arrived with silver rings and a finely bred horse. He spoke of order, of obedience, of eternal damnation for the disloyal. And so, the villagers continued to kneel. But deep in their hearts, something had changed. Faith remained, but it was cracked, thin as old glass. They lit candles still, but they no longer expected answers. And when Edith passed the Virgin statue, she did not bow. She only looked at its silent face and thought for the first time that perhaps the saints had never spoken at all. In the world of Bramblewick, there were no queens in cottages, no ladies with satin sleeves tending rose gardens. The women of the village, like the men, were made of earth and effort. But unlike the men, their burdens were hidden beneath silence. Elswith, wife to Ulrich, mother to Edith, and to women now buried beneath the hawthorn, rose each day with the same heavy rhythm. Before the rooster crowed, she was already awake, stoking the hearth with thin fingers, checking the water pails, feeding what little livestock remained. She moved through her duties like a whisper, unseen but always heard in the creak of the door, the rattle of the kettle, the scraping of the grain bowl. She did not complain. There was no room for it. A woman in Bramblewick was wife, mother, cook, healer, midwife, and sometimes mourner, often all in a single day. From the moment a girl could walk, she was taught to serve, to keep her head lowered, her words soft, and her presence quiet. Her body was not her own. Her labor was expected, her suffering assumed. Marriage was not a choice. Elswith had been wed to Ulrich at 15 summers, her dowry a single goat and 3 linen shifts. He had been kind, in the way that a tired man can be kind, and she had been lucky for that. Many were not. There was Gilda, the blacksmith's wife, whose back bore the scars of her husband's anger, and Maud, married to an old miller in exchange for half a sack of grain, who had lost 3 children in 4 years and still rose each morning to grind flour with bleeding hands. The church spoke often of a woman's virtue, her duty to obey, her place beneath man and God. Father Osmond preached that Eve had brought sin into the world, and that women must redeem themselves through submission. His sermons fell like winter rain, cold, steady, and inescapable. Elswith listened with a bowed head. But inside, she remembered her mother's stories, tales of old goddesses, of forest spirits and moon blessings, whispered by the fire before Father Osmond forbade such tales. She remembered how her mother sang to the herbs as she gathered them, how she kissed the doorframe each new moon. Those songs were gone now, lost beneath wool veils, and prayers she never truly believed. In the village, women were expected to give birth in silence. No midwife shouted, no woman cried aloud, for pain was a punishment and a penance. When Elswith had delivered Edith, she bit down so hard on her knuckles that they bled. When she bore Wymond, alone in the cold of late November, she nearly died from the bleeding. Geetha had come too late that night. Her strength had saved her, or perhaps it was stubbornness. Her body had never fully recovered. She moved slower now, her bones aching more each year. Yet still, no one asked if she was tired. In all things, men held the voice. In the village meetings, it was the fathers and sons who gathered. Women waited at home. When disputes were settled, they were spoken of as property. My wife, his daughter, their girl. No name, just possession. And yet, in the quiet places, the women of Bramblewick held their own power. It was they who remembered the old cures when fever came. They who wove baskets and spun wool through the night, who stitched the shrouds for the dead and the swaddling for the newborns. They who kept the village from falling apart when the men marched to war or drank too deep in the manor's shadow. Elswith, though quiet, was not weak. She had buried a child and still fed another. She had gone hungry to feed her family. She had held Gilda's hand during her 3rd birth, sung over the dying, tended the sick when no one else dared. She kept the stories alive in secret. To Edith, she told them in whispers, of the lady in the woods who could heal with a breath, of the star that blessed weavers with silver-threaded dreams. They were not holy tales, not those of saints and sin, but of endurance and hope. Of women who survived. One night, after a long day spent boiling roots into soup, Edith asked her, "Why don't we speak louder? Why don't we shout when it hurts?" Elswith paused, her hands deep in wool, then said softly, "Because if we shouted every time it hurt, the sky would never stop echoing." The other women understood that silence. It was their armor, their inheritance. When Tila's older sister was forced to wed a man twice her age, they brought herbs to ease her womb. When Geetha was accused of bewitching a cow into stillbirth, the women gathered at her door in the dark and left her bread and cheese in silent defense. They could not change the rules. But they remembered. And in remembering, they endured. Even in the chapel, beneath the weight of sermons and stained-glass saints, they found their own ways to speak. A candle lit not for salvation, but for a lost sister. A braid tied a certain way to ask for protection. A herb tucked in a child's shoe to ward off fever. The men never noticed. Elswith sometimes dreamed of other lives. Of being born a priestess in the old world, crowned in ivy and free to speak her truth. Of being able to read and write, to pen her own name, her own story. But dreams were luxuries, and she had work to do. When she rose each morning, it was not with joy, but with resolve. She lit the fire. She woke Edith. She made the bread, if there was flour enough. She kissed Alric's cheek, and she began again. Not because she was weak, but because she was needed. And above the village, in the manor stone halls, Lady Isolde embroidered roses onto linen she would never soil, while servants brought her warm milk and whispered prayers. She had never bled in the fields, never buried her child beneath cold dirt. But Elswith would have pitied her, for she had never known the fierce, unyielding power of a woman who had nothing but still stood. Beyond the hedgerows of Bramblewick, past the fields of barley and the manor's grazing land, a dirt road ran like a thread through the countryside. Worn by carts and hooves, it stretched from nowhere to nowhere, touching villages that looked just like Bramblewick and skirting forests that no map bothered to name. To the villagers, this road was more than a path. It was a boundary. It marked the edge of their world, the place where familiar soil gave way to danger and uncertainty. Most never ventured beyond it. Many had never even walked its length. It was said that once one left the village behind, one's soul became unrooted, adrift, and vulnerable to spirits or worse. But to the young, the road whispered something different. Edith often watched it from the rise behind their cottage, where the tree stumps gave a small view across the fields. She would sit with her cloak drawn tight and wonder where it led. She had seen travelers pass through now and again, pilgrims with wooden staffs, peddlers with jingling carts, even a minstrel once, who sang songs of cities where buildings rose high as hills and bread was sweet with honey. They never stayed long. Bramblewick offered little but thirst and suspicion. Still, they left behind something rare, a glimpse of life beyond, a glint of freedom. Edith had once asked her father why they could not follow the road. Ulrich had paused mid-swing, his axe buried in a log. "Because the road leads away from our duty," he'd said simply, "and we owe our lives to this land." He had not meant it harshly. It was simply the truth. In feudal life, land was not a home. It was a chain. The lord owned the fields, the woodlands, the pastures, the cottages. Even the stream that ran through Bramblewick was his. To walk away was to forfeit shelter, to become an outlaw. No peasant could leave without permission, and such permissions were rarely granted. Every year during the manor's census, names were recorded by the steward. Each adult was marked by age, role, and obligation. Children were noted as future hands. To disappear was to become a debt unpaid. If caught, a runaway could be flogged, imprisoned, or worse, hung as a thief of labor. Elswith remembered a boy from her youth who had tried. His name was Torin. He had spoken often of the sea, though he had never seen it. One morning, he left before sunrise, carrying only a loaf of rye and a water skin. He was caught 2 villages away and brought back with wrists and irons. The Lord made a lesson of him. They said his screams echoed longer than the bell. Since then, no one had tried. Yet the desire never fully vanished. Even Ulrich, who had grown into the soil like a tree root, sometimes stared down the road at dusk, his brow furrowed as though remembering something half forgotten. Perhaps a story from his father, or a song from a traveler long dead. There was a reason lords feared wanderers. A peasant who did not know their place could become dangerous. Dreams were contagious. But Bramblewick was too poor for rebellion, too tired for treason. The villagers worked, slept, and died within the same few acres of land that had borne their grandfathers. The church warned them of temptation, and the manor punished curiosity. Between those walls, the road remained a rumor. Still, Edith wondered. She wondered what lay beyond the forest's edge, whether cities truly sparkled with candles, whether people in distant places laughed for no reason, or whether there were fields where no steward counted each sheaf. She had no map, no plan, only questions. She carved symbols into the dirt sometimes, birds, stars, a ship with sails, and imagined herself walking away, cloak billowing, eyes lifted. But each time she returned to her chores, to the hearth, to her mother's weary gaze. Even the thought of leaving felt like betrayal. One afternoon, a tinker passed through, pulling a cart of pots and combs. He had kind eyes and spoke of a place called Norwich, where churches pierced the sky and bells rang without fear. He offered a copper brooch to Elswith in exchange for herbs, and to Edith he gave a single word, someday. It lingered in her mind like smoke, yet dreams weighed heavy in Bramblewick. They sank beneath responsibility, beneath hunger and custom. There were cows to feed, children to watch, fields to mend, and no one else would do it for them. Githa, the old healer, once said softly, "The road is a mirror. It shows you what you want, but never gives it." Her fingers, bent with age, had once touched a map she'd never followed. "We all carry a path inside us," she added, "but not all of us walk it." That night, Edith sat beside the cold hearth and stared at the empty flame. She imagined herself older, unchanged, still in the same room, still watching the road through the same window. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she heard waves. But morning came, as it always did, with chores and silence and the weight of duty. The road remained. It always did. And in Bramblewick, no one ever left. Just beyond the edge of Bramblewick, where the fields bled into the whispering thickets of the old forest, there lay a hollow the villagers dared not name aloud. They called it the Witch's Bend, or the Hag's Hollow, or sometimes merely there. It was a circle of trees older than memory, where moss grew in strange swirls and the air stayed cool even on the hottest summer's day. No birds sang there, no children played nearby, and if a goat wandered too close, the herder called it back quickly, whispering a blessing beneath their breath. The hollow had always been a place of fear, though none could say precisely why. No stories were written of it, no event recorded. It simply was, a shadow in the landscape, an echo of a caution older than scripture. Yet in Bramblewick, where hardship loomed over every hearth, fear needed little invitation. That year, the barley failed early. The sheep bore fewer lambs. Then came the child, 12 summers old, strong and full of laughter, struck down by fever so sudden it seemed unnatural. He had danced at the festival just days before. His mother's screams could be heard across the fields. The villagers gathered by the chapel. Father Aldrich, the new priest with the pale hands and thin lips, spoke of temptation, of pride, of sin. "The devil finds purchase," he warned, "where the soil is weak and the will weaker still." He did not speak names. He never needed to. Eyes turned slowly, like leaves toward a sour wind, in the direction of Githa's cottage. Githa had lived alone at the forest's edge for as long as anyone remembered. Some said she was older than the hanging oak itself. She had hair the color of ash and a spine bent like a shepherd's crook. Her fingers were knotted with age, but deft, capable of stitching wounds, setting bones, delivering babies when the midwife could not be found. She knew things no one else did. That had always been her crime. Most kept a respectful distance, offering a loaf of bread in exchange for tinctures or asking quietly for herbs to soothe a cough or quiet a restless child. She asked for little, and she never came to Mass. But in Bramblewick, where silence was often mistaken for defiance, that was enough. It began with whispers. A cow stillborn, a rash that spread too quickly, a candle that would not light. "She passed my garden that morning," one woman muttered. "I saw her mutter as she walked." A boy swore he saw a raven land on her roof at dusk. "Bad omen," the reeve said. "Always bad luck when birds take to witch's wood." And then there was the child's mother. Grief-stricken, hollow-eyed, she stood before the chapel and whispered one name, Githa. It was not a scream. It did not need to be. That night, the village council met beneath torchlight. Ulrich was there, along with the blacksmith, the miller, and others who had seen too much death and too little mercy. Father Aldrich stood among them, not speaking until the silence begged for direction. "She must answer for it," he said softly. "Even the saints expect purity." In the morning, they climbed the hill. Githa answered her door with no surprise. Her eyes, though clouded, held no fear. "I wondered how long it would take," she said, as if greeting an overdue storm. They questioned her gently at first, about herbs, rituals, prayers, about the raven, about the child. She answered plainly, "I gave him willow bark to cool the fever. I prayed for his soul. And as for the raven, God made those birds too, didn't he?" But their minds were already closed. "We've lost too much," the miller muttered. "We need to be sure." Githa looked at each man in turn. "And if I hang, will the barley grow again? Will your children stop dying?" No one answered. She was taken that night, not chained, but followed, watched, and exiled. Her cottage was left standing, her cat vanished into the brush, and the road to the hollow became narrower still. They did not burn her. There was no fire, no gallows. They simply turned her away. She disappeared into the woods without a backward glance. Edith watched from the rise near the edge of the clearing. She saw Geetha's figure vanish between trees, slow but steady, swallowed by green shadows. That evening, the wind changed. A storm rolled over the hills, shaking windows and tearing thatch. By dawn, the fields were soaked, and the priests claimed the rain as a sign of divine cleansing. But the milk still soured. The fever still returned. And no peace came to Bramblewick. Geetha was never seen again. Some claimed to hear her voice in the trees at dusk, singing in a language older than the Psalms. Others said she turned into a crow and flew west. Children dared each other to touch her door. Now overgrown with ivy, the latch rusted with silence. Edith sometimes walked near the hollow, not too close, but near enough to feel the shift in the air. She carried rosemary in her cloak, not from fear, but in memory. In her hand, she held a scrap of wool Geetha had once dyed deep green, the color of moss after rain. She did not believe in witches, but she believed in loneliness. One morning, weeks after Geetha's disappearance, Edith found a small bundle by the stream near the forest's edge. Inside, a dried sprig of feverfew, a bit of honeycomb, and a note written not in ink, but in symbols carved on bark. She could not read it, but she understood. Geetha was alive, and though the village had cast her out, the hollow had made space. From that day forward, when the fever came again, Edith did not go to the chapel. She went to the woods. Not far, just near enough. She left offerings, milk, berries, whispers. And the fever always passed. The forest remembered what the village tried to forget. And in the heart of the hollow, someone still listened. It came with the sound of hooves. One quiet morning in early spring, while mist still clung to the folds of Bramblewick, and the dew had not yet dried from the barley blades, a group of riders approached from the south. They bore the colors of Thornhollow, deep red stitched with black antlers, and behind them trailed a banner edged with gold thread. The villagers saw them from their fields and doorways, hearts quickening not with joy but with dread. For when knights rode into the village, it was never for kindness. The riders stopped before the chapel. Their leader dismounted, boots heavy against the earth, and unfurled a scroll. His voice was clear, cold, and practiced. By decree of Lord Edric of Thornhollow, all able-bodied men of 15 summers and above are hereby summoned to military service in the king's campaign in the north. Those who resist shall be fined or flogged, and their families stripped of land. There were no cries of defiance, no brave protests, just silence, the kind that settles like fog over a graveyard. War was a distant thing to Bramblewick. They had heard of it, yes, of crusades and border skirmishes, of kings vying for more crowns, of distant towns burning in the names of lords they would never meet. But now, that war had come to them. Ulrich was among those called. He stood still, the weight of his name hanging in the air as the steward read the list aloud. His hands, calloused and steady, clenched slowly at his sides. Elswith said nothing. She reached for Edith's shoulder, and the three stood together, unmoving as the names rang out like tolling bells. The next day, the village gathered on the green. 23 men and boys stood in a line, some barely more than children, others grizzled and bent from years in the field. None wore armor. They carried staffs, old hunting spears, or nothing at all. They were not soldiers. They were laborers, fathers, brothers, sons. The knights did not care. They were given one night to prepare. That evening, Elswith packed what little food they could spare: dried peas, flatbread, a strip of salted pork. She stitched a woolen scarf with trembling fingers, the same scarf Ulrich had worn on their wedding day, now repaired more times than she could count. She placed it into his satchel without a word. Ulrich sat beside the hearth with Edith. He told her to mind the goat, to carry water from the south well, since the northern one tasted of iron. He reminded her how to sharpen a blade and to never leave bread uncovered. He told her that he would return before winter. He did not believe it, nor did she. At dawn, the men marched. The road they once feared now swallowed them. They left with only the sound of their steps and the caw of a single crow circling overhead. No fanfare, no songs. Just the rustle of cloaks and the whispered prayers of women who dared not cry aloud. Bramblewick became a village of women, children, and old men. Fields went untended, fences sagged, tools rusted in the rain. The blacksmith's forge grew cold. Without the men, everything slowed. The village bent but did not break. It could not afford to. The goats still needed milking. The grain still needed grinding. Life refused to pause, even in grief. Letters did not come. There were no messengers, no updates, no names posted on chapel doors. The only sign of the war's progress was in the dreams of those left behind. Elswith took to sitting on the cottage step in the evening, her hands busy with thread, but her eyes on the empty lane. She did not weep. She could not. The tears had dried after Wymond. All that remained now was waiting. Edith began to walk the fields at night, alone, listening for something she could not name. She found herself talking to the wind, as if it might carry word from her father. "Are you hungry? Are you cold? Do you miss the sound of the stream?" Once, she found a feather in the shape of a crescent, its edges tinged with red. She placed it beneath her pillow. By midsummer, word began to trickle through travelers, rumors of a great battle near the coast, of blood on the snow, of a retreat. Some said the king had died. Others said he had won. All agreed that many men had not returned. The days passed. Then one morning, a single rider returned. Not a knight, but a courier in faded leather. He carried no banner, no smile, only a list. He pinned it to the chapel door and left. The villagers gathered slowly. The names were written in ink that had bled from rain. Ulrich's name was not there, nor was the blacksmith's, nor the miller's son, but many others were. Some wept, others stared silently. The priest offered a prayer. Elswith simply nodded once, then turned and walked home. Another month passed before Ulrich returned. He came on foot, thinner than before, with a limp in one leg and a scar across his cheek. His eyes were older, his beard untrimmed. He said nothing as he crossed the threshold, just pulled Elswith into his arms and held her there as the fire crackled low. That night, he sat by the hearth and told them little. Not of battles, not of blood, not of friends lost. Only this, it was cold, and I came home. They did not press him. He would never again speak of the war. But when Edith passed him in the fields, she noticed how his gaze would drift toward the sky at sudden sounds, how his hands, once so sure, trembled in sleep, how he never walked near the edge of the forest. And when she asked softly, was it worth it? He only replied, for the king, perhaps. For us, never. In a village like Bramblewick, names were passed like heirlooms. A child took the name of a father or a saint, and with it came a place, a cot by the hearth, a corner of bread, a thread in the tapestry of community. But there were children without such threads, whose names were forgotten or never spoken aloud. Children who slipped through the cracks of record books and memory. One such child lived by the chapel wall. She was no one's daughter, no one's niece, no one's ward. She had come one winter night, 3 years before, no more than 6 or 7, thin as a branch and wrapped in a blanket that smelled of ash and old hay. The villagers found her asleep beneath the stone crucifix, her fingers blue with cold, her lips cracked but still moving, mumbling something no one could understand. They brought her inside, lit a fire, fed her broth, but she did not speak a word of her past. And when Father Osmond asked her name, she only looked away. Since then, she had remained. They called her Linnet, after the small bird that nested near the church roof each spring. It was not her name, but it was something. She slept in the chapel's side chamber on a pallet of straw. Father Osmond, though distant, allowed it. Perhaps he pitied her. Perhaps he saw in her silence something that echoed in himself. She wore cast-off clothing, a tunic once too small for Edith, boots stitched from scrap leather by the blacksmith's wife, a shawl with holes the size of coins. She worked for her place, sweeping the chapel, fetching water, helping Geetha in the garden before the old healer vanished into the forest. No one claimed her, but no one drove her out either. Linnet was part of the village in the way shadows are part of light, present but often unnoticed. She did not laugh with the other children. She did not run or sing or shout, but she listened, she watched, and she remembered. Elswith often left a bit of stew by the chapel door when the pot stretched far enough. Ulrich, when sharpening tools, sometimes gave her a broken blade to play with. Edith offered her thread and bits of cloth, and Linnet would fashion small birds from them, tucking them into nooks and rafters around the village like charms against sorrow. One spring, when the goat miscarried and the air hung thick with loss, Edith found one of Linnet's cloth birds perched atop the cottage windowsill, stitched in blue and gray, its eyes small beads of dark wood. She kept it always. Yet not all were kind. Some whispered that Linnet had brought ill luck. that orphans were signs of divine punishment, or worse, demonic abandonment, that her silence hid secrets. The priest's new sermons, fiery and sharp, spoke often of wolves in sheep's clothing, of serpents disguised as lambs. Though he never said her name, the glances that followed her said enough. Still, she remained. Linnet had a place by the stream where she went each dusk. Beneath a willow, she would sit with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the current twist around stones. No one joined her there. Even Edith, who sometimes followed, kept her distance, not from fear, but respect. That place was hers alone. Some said she had been sent by the saints, others by the forest. But the truth was simpler. She had been forgotten by the world, and Bramblewick had given her a corner to breathe. One day, a merchant passed through, his cart heavy with bolts of fabric and southern spices. He saw Linnet near the well and asked whose child she was. No one answered. He offered to take her as a maid. He had a wife in need of hands and would pay for her passage. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Some villagers nodded. A better life, they said. A roof and a purpose. But Elswith stepped forward. She has both here, she said quietly, and no price was asked. The merchant frowned, but did not argue. He left the next day. Linnet stayed. Edith asked her once in the safety of dusk, "Where do you come from?" Linnet looked at her, eyes wide and clear. Then she lifted one hand and pointed to the horizon. From the place the birds go when the frost comes. It was the only thing she ever said about her past. That winter, Linnet fell ill. A chill that had swept through the chapel settled deep in her lungs. She coughed through the night, and though Elswith brought teas and Edith kept her warm, the fever took hold. Father Aldrich muttered of penance. Others spoke of weakness, but Edith held her hand through each shiver. She did not die, but she never fully returned either. After that, Linnet spoke even less. Her eyes grew distant, her movements slower, yet she remained, sweeping, mending, whispering to the birds that nested beneath the chapel eaves. The cloth creatures she made became more intricate. Some had wings that fluttered in the wind. Some bore stitched patterns that no one had taught her. And always, each spring, she would place one atop the chapel door, as though to ward the building from its own coldness. By the time she was 14, she no longer seemed like a child, though no one could say when the change had come. She was still thin, still quiet, but there was something old in her gaze, something that made even the priest lower his voice when passing. One night, Edith found her beside the stream, a candle burning between them. "Will you ever leave?" she asked. Linnet shook her head. "I don't think I belong anywhere else." Edith nodded. Sometimes it was not love or law that kept someone rooted, but simply the absence of anywhere else to go. And in Bramblewick, where names meant belonging, perhaps the child with no name had made her own place at last, not by blood or birth, but by the quiet endurance of simply being. There came, once a year, a day unlike the others. Not because the sun shone brighter, it rarely did in Bramblewick. Not because the earth forgot its aches, or the lords their taxes, but because for one brief span of hours, the weight of feudal life was set aside, and the people remembered how to smile. It was the Feast of St. Brannock. No one quite remembered who St. Brannock had been. Some said a shepherd who tamed wolves. Others claimed he had turned river stones to bread in the lean years. But the stories mattered less than the custom. The feast had come with their grandfathers, and would likely remain long after their bones had vanished into the soil. The preparations began 3 days early. Elswith rose before dawn to bake the coarse barley cakes saved only for feast days. Flour was tight that year, but she ground the seeds twice, added dried berries from last harvest, and sang under her breath as she stirred. Edith helped knead, her sleeves dusted in flour, her hands warm from the bowl. Ulrich mended the family's good tunic, a hand-me-down from his own father, dyed with faded walnut stain. He had worn it at his wedding, and now he wore it once more, though the seams stretched tighter than before. He brushed his boots with damp moss and spit polish, humming an old song he half remembered from his youth. Even Linnet helped, stringing garlands from willow and yarrow, her silent hands deft as ever. She tied them to the chapel posts, where they fluttered in the wind like offerings to something gentler than gods. For one day, the villagers forgot the famine, the gallows tree, and the weight of debt. They swept the lanes. They hauled barrels of watered cider from the manor's storehouse, a rare gift from the steward, perhaps in fear of being remembered as joyless. A pig was slaughtered and roasted on a spit behind the chapel, its scent curling through the air, awakening hunger long buried beneath modesty. Children laughed without shame. Musicians came, not from far, just old Osbert with his wooden flute and Tilla's brother with a frame drum. But they played as though the fields were green again, as though their fingers had not bled from shearing sheep all spring. Dancing began just after noon. The men lined up by the green, awkward and stiff at first, until the rhythm took them. The women joined in, skirts lifted above the muck, cheeks flushed not from fever but delight. Edith spun once, twice, her feet light, her braid flying behind her like a banner. Ulrich laughed as he hadn't in years. Even Ellsworth smiled. Linnet stood at the edge of the crowd, hands behind her back, watching. A boy offered her a ribbon. She took it, not for him, but for the color, deep blue, like the sky she remembered from dreams. She did not dance, but her eyes sparkled with every turn. And then came the bell. For as long as anyone could remember, the chapel bell had tolled for sorrow, for plague, for death, for judgment. But on this day, once a year, it rang for joy. Father Aldrich climbed the tower himself, his robes patched and flapping like wings, and pulled the rope with both arms. The sound echoed across Bramblewick, deep and round, like laughter given shape. It startled the crows. It stirred something in the fields. For a moment, it felt as if even the sky had paused to listen. The feast continued until the sun began to retreat behind the hills. As the fire dimmed and the music softened, the villagers gathered on the grass with bellies full and hearts lighter than usual. Osbert played a lullaby he had learned from his grandmother, and Tyla sang along, her voice thin, a little off-key but sweet nonetheless. Edith leaned against her father's arm, her head on his shoulder. He placed a hand over hers. Ellsworth sat beside them, knitting silently. Her needles moved slowly, not out of necessity, but rhythm. For once, there was no rush. Linnet rested beneath the old elm near the chapel. She had woven tiny stars from wheat straw and pinned them into the bark. No one asked why. No one disturbed them. That night, the village did not lock its doors. No guards patrolled. No prayers were said in fear. Instead, they slept with the warmth of fire in their limbs and the echo of laughter in their ears. It was not a grand festival. There were no crowns or fireworks, no riches or nobles, but it was theirs. And for one precious day, the people of Bramblewick remembered that they were more than workers, more than burdens, more than names on a ledger. They were a community. They were human. And the next morning, as the sun rose dull and ordinary, they returned to their tasks. Not with joy, perhaps, but with a little more light in their step. The feast of St. Brannock faded once more into memory. The garlands withered. The last crumbs were swept away. The bell was still. But something had stayed. A promise, perhaps, that even in the darkest lives, even in the hardest seasons, joy could still bloom, brief, quiet, and enough. In Bramblewick, where life was measured by the turn of seasons and the yield of soil, old age came quietly, like evening mist settling over the thatch. It was not marked by celebration or reverence. It arrived instead with the slowing of steps, the stiffening of joints, and the fading of names from conversation. Old Osric had lived longer than most. No one could quite say how many winters he had weathered. Some guessed 60, others 70. His back had curved like a bow with the weight of years, and his hands trembled even when still. But his eyes remained sharp, blue as glacial streams, watching the world from the stoop of his cottage with a gaze that seemed to see both now and then. He had no family left. His wife had died in the winter of the ash rain, nearly a decade past. His 2 sons had gone to war. One never returned. The other returned broken and did not last the year. A sister once lived in the next village over, but word of her death had come scrawled on torn parchment, delivered by a traveler who could not pronounce her name. Now Osric lived alone. His cottage stood near the far end of the village, close to the southern gate, where the path curved toward the old salt road. It was small, even by Bramblewick standards, with walls of crumbling daub and a hearth that smoked more than it warmed. Inside, time had gathered in the corners, dust on the rafters, memories stitched into every threadbare blanket. Each morning, he rose before the light. He fed the chickens, 2 old hens too lazy to lay, and fetched water with a bucket that leaked from the base. His hands were slow, his gait unsteady, but he moved with the quiet determination of someone who had survived not by strength but by rhythm. The village had little use for him now. He was too old to till, too weak to mend, too stiff to gather wood. Once he had been the Fletcher, his arrows flown in hunts and skirmishes alike. But now the bow sat untouched above his hearth, and his fingers could no longer draw a string. Still, he offered advice when asked: how to seal a roof with pitch, how to dry meat without salt, how to tell a true fever from one born of fear, but few were asked with each passing year. The young had no patience for slow words, and so Osric sat. He sat beside the green, on a stump worn smooth by his own presence. He watched the chickens. He watched the clouds. He listened to the wind shift through the thatch and tried to remember names that slipped away like rain on stone. Sometimes he hummed old tunes, songs from his mother's voice, back when the world was still filled with color and the church bells had rung for joy more than mourning. One day, Edith came to sit beside him. She was carrying a basket of wool, her fingers nimble as they twisted strands for dyeing. She did not speak at first. Neither did he. They watched the sky grow pink with evening. "Why do you sit here?" she asked softly. Osric smiled. "Because the world still speaks, and I've grown quiet enough to hear it." She returned often after that. Not daily, not always, but enough. She brought bits of cheese, sometimes a plum if the season was kind. He told her stories, not grand ones of kings or dragons, but small tales of village life long past, of how the river used to flood every third spring, and how once the entire village danced in the rain after the first proper harvest in 15 years. She listened, not because the tales were exciting, but because they were his, because they were what remained of Bramblewick's oldest voice. Others passed him by without much thought. The priest gave him a nod on Sundays. The steward ignored him entirely. Children sometimes mocked the way he muttered to himself, though not cruelly, more out of unease, as if sensing something not quite of their world. But Osric never minded. He had come to accept that the world moved on without waiting, that time did not honor the old, only replaced them. He had no desire for grandeur, no hope for legacy. He wanted only to be remembered kindly, or not at all. One winter evening, a heavy frost settled over the village. The fire in Osric's hearth would not catch. His fingers, too numb to coax the flame, shook with frustration. He wrapped himself in wool and sat before the cold hearth, humming quietly as the shadows grew long. That night, Edith knocked on his door. She brought dry kindling and a bit of resin. She lit the fire and brewed tea from herbs she had gathered with Ellsworth. They sat in silence, the flames dancing on the walls. "You shouldn't be alone," she said. "I've always been alone," he replied, not sadly. "But you don't have to be," she answered. Osric smiled then, truly smiled, the kind that curled not just lips but eyes. He reached into a small box beside his chair and pulled out a carved figure, a tiny horse, smooth and polished. "For you," he said. "Made it long ago. Never had someone to give it to." Edith took it with both hands. It was imperfect, slightly uneven, but it was warm with memory. The next morning, the village awoke to frost still clinging to eaves and silence lingering over the southern lane. Osric had passed in his sleep. He was buried near the stream, beside the stones where he had once taught boys to shape arrowheads from flint. The priest spoke the rites. Edith placed the wooden horse at the base of his grave. No great crowd mourned. But in the weeks that followed, something shifted. The children no longer laughed at the stump where he had sat. They left small trinkets there, feathers, pebbles, bits of cloth. Edith often paused on her walk to the well, her fingers brushing the bark of the old tree beside it. And sometimes, in the soft quiet of dusk, the village would seem to listen just a little more, as if waiting for a voice that had learned to hear the world, and had for a time taught them to do the same. In Bramblewick, the river was a lifeline. It was not wide nor deep, but it curled through the village like a ribbon of silver, its waters cool even in midsummer. Children bathed in its shallows, women washed their linens along its banks, and the men dipped pails into its current during the long days of harvest. It gave fish in lean months, and its banks birthed herbs the healer once used with care. It was, in its way, holy. So when the river changed, the people did not know how to answer. It began with rain, not a storm, not a downpour, but a steady, relentless weeping from the sky that began one gray morning and did not stop. Day after day, it fell in soft sheets, soaking thatch and earth alike. The fields grew heavy, the wells brimmed, the chickens grew restless, feathers slicked with damp. By the fourth day, the stream's edges disappeared. By the seventh, it had become something else. Ulrich stood beside the cottage, watching the flood creep across the barley. His boots sank into the mud and his jaw tightened. He had seen flood once before, as a boy, but never like this. Edith helped Elswith move sacks of grain to the rafters. The floor had grown soft beneath their feet, and rats had begun to flee the holes like refugees. Outside, Linnet stood near the edge of the rising water, her eyes fixed on the current, unmoving even as the wind blew her shawl sideways. Then the river rose further. It happened at night, when the sky flashed with distant lightning and the wind turned course. The banks, weakened from days of pressure, gave way with a low groan like a great animal in pain. Water poured into the village with the force of hooves, sudden and deafening. It swept through the lower cottages, lifted carts from their resting places, and tore fences from the ground. The people of Bramblewick awoke to shouting, to the sound of chickens screaming, of pigs loose in the dark, of children sobbing in their mother's arms. Ulrich burst through the door and lifted Edith to the loft before the water reached the threshold. He returned for Elswith, who clung to the hearthstones as if they might hold the earth together. "Go," she cried, but he did not answer. He carried her up with a strength born of fear. By morning, half the village was underwater. The chapel steps were submerged. The blacksmith's forge, once roaring with fire, now sat silent beneath brown ripples. A cow had drowned in its pen, its eyes open to the sky. The mill was gone, taken whole by the current. The priest stood atop the bell tower, staring down like a man who had lost his flock and his voice. And still the rain did not stop. The villagers gathered on the green, or what remained of it, wrapped in soaked cloaks, faces pale and hollow. They whispered not of survival, but of punishment. "This is judgment," said one. "For Githa." "No," said another. "For the war." "No," said a third. "For forgetting how to pray." But the river did not explain itself. Days passed. The water did not rise further, but it did not recede. Fires would not light. The cold crept in. Bread molded. Fever took root in lungs still wet with terror. And the silence, oh, the silence between storms, was filled with a tension so thick it hung in the air like smoke. Elswith fell ill, not with plague nor wound, but with something quieter. Her breath grew shallow, her fingers cold despite the blankets. Edith tried every herb she knew. Ulrich burned dry roots, boiled bark, sang to her as he had once sung to Wymond in his crib. But she drifted, slow and light as leaves in autumn. "She's slipping," Edith whispered to Linnet. Linnet nodded. "I don't know what else to do." "Then sit with her," the girl said softly. "That's all the river cannot take." And so they did. They sat with her as the water pooled below. As the rain finally stopped, as the clouds broke one by one, revealing a sky too pale to trust. Eventually, the river began to retreat, not quickly, not completely, but with the same slow silence it had kept when rising. The fields reappeared, heavy with silt. The cottages bore stains like bruises along their walls. The animals returned, thinner, meaner. The chapel reopened, though the bell never rang again. Some villagers left. To where, no one could say. But they vanished, quietly, in twos and threes. Perhaps to higher ground, perhaps to myth. Elswith recovered, but she never truly returned. Her voice grew softer, her hands more still. She began sleeping with her face toward the window, watching the river even when it slept. Ulrich rebuilt the fence. Edith retilled the garden, planting not seeds but stones at first, to mark the new boundary between land and water. Linnet wove charms from reeds and left them by each door. And the river, once feared, became sacred again. But not for its beauty, for its memory, for what it had taken and what it had not. The people of Bramblewick would never speak of it as they had before. No more swimming, no more singing near its edge, only soft steps and silent glances. And sometimes on misted mornings when the water moved just so, they swore they saw faces in the current, smiling, weeping, watching, waiting. In Bramblewick, wealth did not gleam. It was not seen in gilded mirrors or tall stone towers, but in the size of one's woodpile, the plumpness of hens, or whether the bread was made with barley or rye. True coin, silver, copper, gold, rarely passed through the fingers of its folk. Most had never touched a shilling. Their worth was measured in sacks of grain, hours bent to the plow, and the number of bodies that could labor when summoned. Yet wealth was demanded all the same. Each season came with its due. Spring brought the seed tax, when a portion of the village's stored grain was claimed by Lord Edric's steward for the health of the estate. Summer brought the tool levy, when families were expected to surrender blades and iron for the Lord's armory. Autumn carried the harvest tithe, a tenth of every bushel, every fruit, every blessed turnip. And winter, cruelest of all, carried the hearth tax, a fee for the smoke that rose from one's own chimney. It mattered not whether the fire burned warm or weak. The tax was for the right to live. Ulrich had long since given up arguing. Each season, he watched the steward arrive on horseback, flanked by men in padded tunics, their ledgers inked with thin scorn. They took with words and weight, pointing to sacks and jugs, marking what was owed with gestures that bore no room for refusal. One year, when the barley had failed and the rains had spoiled the apples, Ellsworth tried to reason with the steward. She offered dried herbs, cloth she had spun, even the carved spoon her mother had passed to her as a wedding gift. "It is not a matter of trade," the steward said, his voice wrapped in velvet and vinegar. "It is a matter of duty." Duty. The word choked like smoke. They gave what they could. What remained was never enough. That winter, Ulrich bartered his cloak, lined with rabbit fur, a gift from his father, for a measure of flour he would not taste. The miller took it slowly and said nothing. In Bramblewick, charity was not denied, but it came with silence. Edith, now in the first breath of womanhood, began weaving beside the hearth long into the night. Her fingers bled into the threads. She made narrow bands and belts to trade for eggs, and once for a wax candle she kept hidden in a carved box. Linnet offered her birds. Made from scraps, stitched with ash and wool, they were never sold, but sometimes left on thresholds. No one ever spoke of it. But now and then, a doorstep with one of her birds went untouched by the steward's hand. The manor, meanwhile, shone brighter than ever. Lord Edric hosted a hunt that year, deer driven from the woods by the beaters, hounds barking like drums, peasants lined the road, heads bowed as the noble party passed. The lord wore a cloak stitched with fox fur and a chain that clinked with every step. His steward rode behind, reading from his ledger, lips moving as he named each cottage, each hearth, each mouth that owed. No one looked up. In the days after, rumors spread that the steward had increased the wool levy, that 3 families had been fined for failing to present their bushels on time, that Oswin, the thatcher, had been flogged for keeping 2 chickens hidden in a bramble thicket. Ellsworth wept that night, not for the chickens, but for the humiliation. She had grown up with Oswin. He once gave her daisies when they were both 10. To see him shamed like a thief broke something quiet inside her. But still, the taxes came. There were no exemptions, not for widows, not for the sick, not even for the chapel, which gave up its candles when coin ran dry. Father Aldrich spoke often of obligation, of rendering unto Caesar, but his chalice was silver, and his boots never had holes. One summer, a new tax was announced, the bridge toll. A narrow wooden bridge had been built over the stream, a small thing, barely wider than a cart, but every villager crossing it, whether by foot or hoof, now owed a penny. A penny no one had. Ulrich carried Edith across the ford instead. His boots sank deep, and once he stumbled, nearly losing his grip. But he laughed, weakly, and she smiled back, pretending it was a game. Linnet never crossed. She simply remained on the chapel side, where her birds watched the bridge from the trees. Over time, resentment settled in the village like mildew. But not rebellion. That was for men with swords. The people of Bramblewick endured. They patched what they could. They grew quieter in the steward's presence. They found ways to hide, sometimes a jar of honey buried beneath the hearth, sometimes a hen passed quietly from door to door. And in the evenings, when the fire still dared to burn, Ulrich would sit with Edith and Ellsworth, staring at the flames, whispering stories of times when taxes were light, when the Lord's men were lazy, when the forest gave freely. They were likely lies. But lies, in lean years, were a kind of bread. One day, the steward did not come. A new lord had taken Thornhollow. Edric had died, of gout, some said, or treachery, or a hunting mishap. The details mattered little. The new lord sent a different steward. He was no gentler, only younger. His cloak was blue, his ledger was longer, and the taxes continued. Only the names changed. Justice, like bread, was something Bramblewick had learned to live without in times of scarcity. The word existed, of course, spoken in sermons and carved into stone tablets behind the chapel altar. It rang in the oaths of knights, dripped from the mouths of stewards, and glinted in the wax seals of lordly letters. But for the folk of Bramblewick, justice was not a shield. It was a story told by others. When Eamon, the carpenter's son, was found beaten near the edge of the manor woods, the villagers knew at once who had done it. Sir Tobold, one of the new lord's retinue, had taken a dislike to the boy during a timber survey. Some said Eamon had spoken out of turn. Others said he had simply been in the way. Whatever the truth, his face was bloodied, his arm broken, and his spirit cracked like green wood. He lived, but he never carved again. The villagers gathered quietly outside the chapel, some clutching baskets of herbs, others just folded hands. They did not shout. They did not accuse. They simply waited for an apology, for a trial, for something resembling reckoning. But the Lord's court never convened for a peasant. Father Aldrich offered prayer, but no protest. The steward, when asked, replied coolly, "The boy trespassed where he should not have walked. The knight acted within his rights to defend the crown's land." There was no mention of the bruises on his back, nor of the torn scraps of his tunic found in the brush. Ulrich said nothing, but that night, when Edith asked why no one spoke louder, he stared long at the fire and replied, "Because the louder we speak, the sooner we vanish." It was not cynicism. It was instruction. There had been a time, long ago, when a village reeve might take disputes to the manor court, when a theft might be heard before a jury of freemen, when a poacher, if lucky, might be fined rather than hanged. But those days were gone, or perhaps they had never truly existed. Now the law served coin and blood. To steal a crust of bread was to risk a whipping. To snare a rabbit on the Lord's land meant the stocks. But to strike a peasant, especially for a man with a title, was a matter of misunderstanding or silence. And silence was always enforced. Linnet, quiet as ever, had once seen a man dragged from his cottage in the night for speaking ill of the seal. She did not say whose seal. She did not say more, only that the man had not returned. Elswith began to keep their shutters latched tighter after dark. The villagers adapted. They stopped expecting justice. They learned to resolve disputes quietly, through barter, through apology, through long walks down narrow lanes. When two men fought over a boundary stone, they did not go to the steward. They went to Ulrich, who had lived long enough to remember the land when it was still shaped by trees, not ink. When a young girl was wronged by a man who wore leather gloves and did not give his name, her family did not cry out. They moved to the far end of the village and never spoke of her laughter again. Justice belonged to parchment. Bramblewick lived in mud. And yet, despite it all, the people still yearned for fairness. Edith, now 17, wrote her first letter, carefully, slowly, with ink borrowed from the chapel. She addressed it not to the king, nor the bishop, but to a reeve she had once heard of in a village 4 days' ride away, where it was said some farmers still had voice. She never received a reply, but she kept the letter folded in cloth beside a dried sprig of yarrow and a carving Osric had once given her. There were small acts of justice, too fragile to be named. When Eamon's father fell ill, the village took turns mending his fence. When the widow Maud was fined for missing a tithe, 3 families pooled eggs to pay her share. When a knight's dog bit a child's hand and the steward offered no aid, Geetha's old book of herbs was passed from Elswith to Edith to Linnet. These were not laws, but they were right, and sometimes that was enough. Still, fear hung in the thatch. Each hoofbeat on the lane sent faces to windows. Each summons from the manor caused stomachs to clench. Each visit from the steward came with calculations. What could be hidden? What could be spared? What price might be paid if a word was said too boldly? One autumn, the priest delivered a sermon on order. He spoke of obedience as virtue, of structure as divine, of silence as holiness. He held up the example of the dove, the lamb, the tiller of soil. He spoke nothing of wolves. Afterward, as the villagers filed out into the drizzle, Ulrich leaned down to Edith. "Doves have no teeth," he murmured. "That's why they never change the world." Edith looked at him for a long moment. Then silently, she pulled the folded letter from her pocket and tossed it into the stream. She had hoped for reply. Now she chose something quieter. She chose to stay, to remember, to build not justice, but resilience. And though the law never came for Bramblewick, neither did it fully erase them. They endured, not because they were protected, but because they protected each other. In silence, in bread, in broken tools shared, in watchful eyes and firelight. And sometimes that was more than the law could ever offer. In Bramblewick, dreaming was not spoken of aloud. To want more than bread, more than shelter, more than safety was to tempt ridicule, or worse, suspicion. Dreams, if named, risked being mistaken for rebellion, and rebellion had no place in a village where the soil remembered every footstep and the sky bore witness to silence. But dreams still lived, tucked between the beams of thatched roofs and buried beneath the hard-packed floors of cottages. They lived in the spaces between cores, in the slow stirring of soup, in the hush of evening when even the wind dared not speak too loud. Edith dreamed more than most. She had never seen a city, but she imagined one often, tall buildings of stone, colored glass that held the light like caught rain, books lined on shelves taller than men. She pictured fountains where birds drank and music played not by chance but by design. She had never seen the sea, but she dreamed of it too. Not as others did, with fear or trade in mind, but with awe, a stretch of silver that breathed, vast and eternal, touching places she could not name. Sometimes in the quiet, she drew them. In the margins of her linen scraps, with charcoal or berry dye, she traced windows with pointed arches, towers topped with stars, ships with sails shaped like wings. Her hands, worn and calloused, still moved gently over cloth, crafting a world that had no place in Bramblewick. Ulrich noticed. One evening, as they sat near the fire, he picked up one of her sketches and studied it by the flicker of flame. A tower, impossibly high, with birds circling like sentinels. "Is this real?" he asked, half smiling. "It could be," Edith said softly. He nodded. "Then hold on to it." Elswith said little of Edith's dreams, but she mended her daughter's cloak with extra care and once gifted her a small square of linen dyed blue, rare, costly, but kept hidden for years. "You'll know what to do with it," she said simply. Linnet, too, dreamed, but hers were quieter, less visible. She stared at the stars and whispered names she had made for them. The weaver's needle, the sleeping fox, the door without a handle. She never asked where they led. She simply believed they meant something. She collected feathers and bones and shards of broken pottery, not for trade, but for arrangement. Beneath the eaves of the chapel, where no one swept, she laid them in patterns, constellations beneath the earth. "They're maps," she told Edith once, "but not for feet, for thought." The priest called them idle distractions. The steward called them signs of idleness. But they were neither. They were survival. To imagine a world beyond the immediate, to believe in more than what one sees, was a balm for the soul when the body could find no comfort. Not all understood. The blacksmith's son laughed when he saw one of Edith's towers. "No buildings that tall," he scoffed. "Why would anyone want to go so high?" She did not answer. She had learned not to defend the intangible. Still, the dreams persisted. Edith began carving on wood, small, simple, a window here, a curved stair there. When her chores were done and the goats fed, she sat behind the cottage and worked in silence. Ulrich built her a bench from an old fence post. He did not say it was for dreaming, but she knew. One day, a traveler passed through, a mason, they said, bound for the coast. His hands were thick and his eyes sharp. He noticed Edith's carvings laid out to dry. "Yours?" he asked. She nodded. He lifted one, traced the arch with a dirty thumb. "There's work in the south, cathedrals rising from cowfields. You ever want to see real stone? Follow the dust." Then he walked on. Edith watched him vanish down the road, his boots leaving shallow prints in the dirt. She didn't follow. Not yet. But that night, she dreamt of walls so high they caught thunder. Bramblewick, of course, remained unchanged. The taxes came. The crops rose and fell. The priest warned against vanity. The steward passed without greeting. But beneath the sameness, a quiet current had shifted. Linnet's patterns became more intricate. Edith's drawings grew larger. Other children began to ask questions. What's a cathedral? What's across the sea? What if we could fly? No answers came. But questions in themselves were a kind of light. Ulrich, though older, started walking further each morning. He claimed it was to check the south field. But sometimes he paused on the ridge and stared at the horizon. Elswith began humming again. Not hymns, but lullabies from her girlhood. tunes her own mother had sung beneath the eaves during long winters. And one morning, before the first frost, Edith pinned her blue square of linen to the tallest branch she could reach. It fluttered in the breeze like a banner, soft and defiant. The priest frowned when he saw it. Ulrich simply nodded. It remained there through the season untouched, a bright whisper of belief among the browns and grays. And though Bramblewick never spoke of dreams as loudly as laws or land, something had changed. The soil still bound their feet, but their minds? Their minds had learned to walk further. The crows came as they always did, before the earth had softened, before the first shoots dared emerge, before the air had shed its bite. They circled thrice above Bramblewick, black against the gray sky, then settled upon the chapel spire, as though reclaiming a perch that was rightfully theirs. To the villagers, the crows were not just birds, they were witnesses. They had seen too much to be mere creatures of feather and flight. Their eyes, dark and sharp, had watched as time folded the village into seasons and sorrow, joy and drought. They had seen plows fail and children born. They had watched women sing beside empty cradles and old men carve warmth from nothing but ash. They remembered, and they returned. That spring, something was different. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable, like the moment frost turns to dew. Edith had grown taller, not in stature, but in presence. She walked with measured steps, her eyes now less full of wonder and more full of memory. Her hands, though still young, carried the echo of her mother's gestures, the way Elswith had once tucked hair behind her ear while listening or pressed her palm flat against wood to feel its story. Ulrich's beard had thinned, though his voice had not. He still tended the boundary stones, still fixed the chapel's shutter when the wind pulled at it like a child seeking comfort. But now, he walked more slowly, with the dignity of a man who knew every pebble in the path. Linnet had become the keeper of quiet things. She no longer hid her birds made of straw or bone. She arranged them openly, in concentric circles outside the chapel door, or perched upon fence posts like guardians of unseen shrines. No one questioned her anymore. In Bramblewick, oddness had long since learned to sit beside truth. The village still bore its scars. Stones were missing from the south wall where the flood had once pushed. The chapel roof bowed slightly. One house had never been rebuilt after the fire 2 winters prior. But the people had learned not to see these things as ruin. They were reminders, each mark a verse in the village's long, unwritten poem. When spring came fully, it did not announce itself with flowers, but with breath. Warmer air drifted through the cracks. The soil loosened beneath fingernails. Chickens clucked with renewed indignation, and goats kicked as though dreaming of green hills. And the crows stayed. They watched from their place atop the chapel, not cawing as much as listening to laughter that came again, slowly, to Edith's footsteps in the garden, to Linnet humming as she scattered seeds no one could name. The bell in the chapel tower had not rung in years. Its rope had frayed, and no one had bothered to replace it. And yet, some mornings, people said they felt it ring, not in their ears, but in their ribs, a hush in the bones, a trembling that reminded them something sacred had once lived in that space, and perhaps still did. One morning, just after the thaw, a boy named Weil, barely old enough to carry a bucket, asked Edith why the crows came. She paused. Because they remember, she said. Remember what? Us. That afternoon, Edith climbed the chapel ladder. She did not ring the bell. Instead, she laid her hand upon it, palm flat, as if greeting an old friend. The crows did not fly. One tilted its head, curious. Another blinked once, very slowly. I'm still here, she whispered, and the wind, soft and steady, seemed to carry the words. That night, the village gathered, not for mourning nor celebration, but for the telling of stories. It had become a custom, quiet and unannounced. They sat around the hearth outside the blacksmith's barn, and each person shared something they remembered. Not great events, not grand truths, but the small things. The way Osric used to smell of cedar and smoke. The time Elswith had sung a lullaby that hushed not just a child but the wind. The bird Linnet had crafted from a broken comb that still hung in the bakery's rafter. Edith spoke last. I don't remember the world, she said, but I remember the way Bramblewick breathes. And that was enough. Later, when the fire had gone to embers and the people returned to their homes, the crows remained, watching, waiting. They did not need to fly. They had already carried the stories. The next morning, the traveler came. He bore a satchel worn thin and boots covered in 5 kinds of dust. He asked no questions, only gestures. Water, a place to sit, the nod of thanks. The village offered these things as naturally as breath. He lingered 3 days. On the 4th, he carved a shape into the old oak at the village edge. Not a name, nor a mark of ownership, but a feather. Then he was gone. When asked who he was, Edith only smiled. Someone who remembers. And as the sun dipped behind the hills and the chapel's shadow stretched across the grass, the crows lifted. They rose not in panic, nor haste, but in ceremony. Circling thrice as they had when they came, they turned toward the trees, disappearing like thoughts at the edge of sleep. But they would return. They always did. For Bramblewick, though silent, was never forgotten. It lived in the hands of its people, in the cracks of stone and the curve of roofs, in the way names were passed from lips to wind, never shouted but never lost. It lived because it had been seen, by those who stayed, by those who dreamed, and by the crows, black as ink, who never needed to speak, because they remembered.